The key turned in the lock with the familiar double click, muffled only slightly by the excessive wool scarf I wore. The smell of pine and roasting turkey hit me immediately, the rich, comforting scent of every Christmas I had worked so hard to provide. I dropped my worn suitcase, still covered in airport stickers, and walked directly toward the living room where the noise was loudest. That's when my 20-year-old son, Elias, whose face I hadn't properly seen in months, turned from the fireplace, looked me dead in the eye, and the rush of joy froze instantly on my face. "Who invited you?" he asked, his voice flat, clear and loud enough to silence the whole room. I felt the blood rush out of my extremities, leaving me instantly cold despite the roaring fire and the thick sweater I was wearing. It wasn't just the horrifying words. It was the total absence of warmth, the calculated distance in his posture, the casual cruelty of his expression. I looked past him, searching for rescue. My husband, Thomas, was standing beside Elias, holding a glass of something amber, but he didn't intervene, didn't smile, didn't offer a hug, didn't even move. He just watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable, a blank, neutral stare that was infinitely more damning than immediate anger. In that terrifying silent second, before my brain could process the gravity of the insult, my gut screamed a primal warning. I had come prepared for typical holiday stress, for too much wrapping paper and burnt cookies, but I was not remotely prepared for the true, devastating price I was about to pay for stepping back into this house. Something fundamental had shifted in my absence, and the casual greeting I expected was about to be replaced by an agonizing, slow-motion demolition of everything I believed was mine. For the last 18 months, I, Maria, had been living out of a small, sanitized corporate apartment 3 states away, grinding through the final phases of a massive engineering project. I had taken the contract specifically to pay off Elias's college debt in advance and secure Thomas's early retirement fund. It was a brutal schedule that devoured every weekend, every holiday, and every spare moment of sleep. I missed every family milestone: Thomas's 50th birthday, Elias's major presentation, countless quiet Sunday dinners that I now realized held more value than all the money I earned. But I bore the crushing loneliness and the constant exhaustion with the firm conviction that this profound sacrifice was the ultimate demonstration of my love and commitment. I was Maria, the rock, the provider, the woman who made sure the foundation never cracked under the weight of debt or uncertainty. I measured my real success not in promotions or bonuses, but in the unshakable stability of the home I kept meticulously running from afar. My life in that temporary apartment wasn't glamorous. It was dedicated, cold, and relentlessly focused on this moment, the triumphant return. I flew home exhausted, smelling faintly of airplane disinfectant and ambition, clutching a cheap plastic box containing the one thing I cherished most, the promise of finally being back where I belonged, safe in the center of my family, ready to be loved for the effort I gave. I never once considered that the house would still be standing, but that I would be the one who was suddenly and completely disinvited. The cheap plastic box, which hours ago felt like a talisman of my sacrifice, was now just a brittle weight in my hand as I stood in the foyer. The house was immaculate, strangely silent, and smelling of unfamiliar jasmine and expensive new wood. I didn't have to search long for the evidence of my exclusion. It was displayed with chilling efficiency on the polished marble counter that had replaced the worn cedar table of my memory. It was an elaborate, glossy invitation suite for a family unity gala scheduled for the following weekend. Not a welcome home party, but a celebration already organized, planned, and finalized in my absence. I picked up the heavy cardstock. My eyes scanned the list of honored attendees and the names of those serving on the organizing committee: Mark, Aunt Clara, Cousin David, even the next-door neighbor who waters the petunias. My name, the name of the daughter who had spent 7 years building the very foundation of this financial security they were now celebrating, was not merely misspelled or misplaced. It was absent, entirely. A clean surgical cut. My initial shock hardened into a frigid analytical focus, the kind I usually reserved for high-stakes contract negotiations. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate statement. I retreated, unable to sustain the illusion of normalcy in the open foyer. I needed answers, but more importantly, I needed proof that this was a terrible mistake. I slipped into the small, rarely used study, now smelling faintly of disinfectant and ozone, the scent of a professional cleaning service. I found the accompanying informational booklet for the gala, detailing seating charts, speeches, and a meticulously curated family legacy timeline. I flipped through the heavy pages, my fingers trembling slightly as I searched the chronology of the past decade. There were snapshots of Mark's graduation, blurry pictures of Mom and Dad on trips I funded, and a surprisingly detailed account of the dog's dental surgery. Then came the 7 years I had spent overseas, years of grinding, isolation, and constant sacrifice. My entire effort, my professional life, the reason for my absence, the very reason they could afford this glossy celebration, was summarized by a single grainy, out-of-focus photograph of a particularly overgrown rosebush. The caption underneath, small and almost apologetic, read, "The Quiet Interlude." I was not a person who was gone. I was a statistical anomaly, a gap in the timeline, an interlude of silence. I gripped the spine of the booklet until the pages creased. My heart pounded not from anger, but from a profound, terrifying disorientation. I had expected them to be proud of the woman I had become. They didn't even acknowledge the girl who left. I tried calling Mark again. He answered instantly this time, his voice tight, lacking the usual booming cheer. "Look, I told you, everything is handled. We're swamped with arrangements. Just relax, okay?" "Relax? Mark, I'm holding the invitation. Why am I not listed? Where is my name?" I tried to keep the rising panic out of my voice. There was a heavy pause on the line, thick with unspoken communication. It was complicated, sis. Logistical issues. We had to keep the head count strict. We can talk about it next week. Please don't cause a scene. Logistical issues. I felt the blood drain from my face. They cut me out to meet a head count, me, their only other child, and the phrase, "don't cause a scene," was the final devastating confirmation. They knew I wasn't on the list, and they expected me to accept the exclusion silently. My successful return wasn't an event to be celebrated. It was a logistical inconvenience to be managed. I hung up without another word, the silence louder than any argument. I knew then that the problem wasn't the party. The problem was my fundamental misreading of my value to them. I needed to see how deep the erasure went, not through their lies, but through the physical evidence of my former life. I climbed the stairs, the expensive plush carpet muffling my footsteps, making me feel like a thief in my own home. I stopped outside the door to what was unequivocally my room. It was the only space in the house where I allowed myself to feel sentimentality, the room I had mentally redecorated 1,000 times during lonely nights abroad. I pushed the door open tentatively, half expecting dust sheets and storage boxes. Instead, I found a minimalist, hyper-efficient space dominated by a massive curved 4K monitor and an intimidating ergonomic desk. My small, battered mahogany desk, the one my grandfather carved, was gone. My meager bookshelf, which held the few dog-eared paperbacks I kept for comfort, was replaced by floor-to-ceiling shelving housing pristine financial binders and corporate compliance reports. There was not a single photograph, not a single piece of childish art, not a single visible scar on the hardwood floor that indicated I had ever spent 17 years sleeping, studying, or dreaming in that space. It wasn't just repurposed. It was professionally sanitized. Then I saw it. A small, personalized calendar pinned discreetly above the monitor. It was open to the current month. Scribbled in neat block letters on the day of my supposed return, today, was a single entry, circled 3 times in red ink. Finalize lease agreement, basement unit. Basement unit. They hadn't disinvited me. They had downgraded me. The triumph I had worked 7 years for had culminated not in the embrace of the family home, but in an implied rental agreement for the damp, windowless cellar. The house was standing, immaculate and secure, but the foundation it stood on was built on the complete, meticulous destruction of my reality. My return was just an expense they planned to compartmentalize and hide below ground. The air caught in my throat, not from sadness, but from the realization that this was far colder, far more calculating than simple betrayal. This was a business decision. I slid the single suitcase across the polished mahogany floor of the cellar suite, the sound echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and disuse, a clinical reality that eclipsed any lingering emotional drama. I didn't cry or rage. Those were luxuries afforded to the sincerely betrayed. My reaction was forensic. I unpacked essentials, a change of clothes, my laptop, and a small audio recorder. I wasn't home. I was conducting an investigation from a compromised base camp. Compliance was my weapon now. I would play the role of the quiet, grateful prodigal, observing the architecture of their deceit, brick by calculated brick. The next 3 days passed in a strange, silent ballet. My mother perfected the art of non-existence, bustling through the kitchen only when I was absent, leaving pre-portioned microwavable meals on a corner tray. My father remained locked in his newly soundproofed study. The only communication, a financial ledger, slipped under my door, containing itemized utility contributions for the month, an insulting invoice for the privilege of subterranean existence. There was no argument, no raised voices, just the meticulous administration of my exile. This silence was far heavier than any confrontation, confirming that my status had been legally redefined long before my return. The first structural fault in their meticulous facade appeared on Thursday morning, resting innocently beside the pristine silver sugar bowl. It was a cream-colored, heavily embossed envelope, too formal for junk mail, addressed only to the residents. Curiosity, or perhaps professional paranoia, compelled me. Inside were 3 personalized heavy stock cards for the annual Summer Solstice Trust Gala, the family's keystone social event, where my father customarily made a major philanthropic announcement and confirmed the year's beneficiaries. The invitation confirmed 3 names: Mother, Father, and Clara. My younger sister, who hadn't spoken to me in 6 years, was listed prominently in the immediate family party. My name was absent. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate public declaration of my redefined perimeter. I was not just unwelcome, I was actively erased from the social ledger, barred from the very gathering where the family legacy, which was inherently mine, was discussed and reaffirmed. The insult wasn't the missed party. It was the chilling implication that they had already finalized the paperwork regarding my separation from the family's assets, and this social exclusion was merely the public announcement of the private legal maneuver. They hadn't just removed my name from the guest list. They had removed me from the definition of family. My hands didn't tremble as I carefully placed the invitations back exactly as I found them. The surge of anger was cold and directed, focusing not on the emotional sting, but on the logistics of their cover-up. If they were comfortable making my exclusion this obvious, the real documentation, the legal instruments solidifying this business decision, had to be profoundly protected. The cellar was inconvenient. The utility bill was petty, but this missing invitation was a GPS coordinate pointing directly toward the vault. They were so confident in their control that they became sloppy. Later that afternoon, armed with the pretense of retrieving a forgotten book, I entered the silent, overly tidy living room. My eyes were drawn not to the bookshelves, but to the area near, the fireplace where Father often left his briefcase. The briefcase was gone, replaced by a newly installed shallow-depth safe disguised seamlessly behind a sliding panel of wainscoting. It wasn't the kind of bulky safe meant to deter professional thieves. It was the kind meant to hide a few crucial documents from amateur snoops, like a returning disinherited daughter. The air suddenly felt thinner, charged with the electric certainty of discovery. They had physical barriers now, which meant they had something definitive to hide. The sight of the safe crystallized the true nature of the battle. This wasn't about love, forgiveness, or even inheritance. It was about proprietary control. My return had been categorized as a threat to their established structure, and their response was not familial reconciliation, but asset protection. I retreated to the cellar, the silence of my underground cage now feeling less like a punishment and more like a tactical advantage. They thought they had neutralized me by burying me below ground. They failed to realize that the dark offered perfect cover for planning, and the cold reality of my situation had extinguished the last vestiges of my conscience. I was no longer seeking justice. I was seeking leverage. The cold was my clock, and the drip of the condensation pipe my only metronome. Days bled into weeks down here, and the silence that had once been a tactical shield had begun to feel like a sensory deprivation chamber designed to make me confess to crimes I didn't commit, or perhaps to crimes I was about to. My focus had narrowed to the thermal output of the main heating duct, the conduit through which I had threaded a cheap, highly sensitive microphone, barely larger than a mosquito. It was my only umbilical, cord to the world above, an unreliable witness to their normalcy. For days the recordings were mundane, the clatter of silverware, the endless loop of my father's preferred classical music, the sound of my mother arguing with a landscaper about the precision of the hedge trim. It was the sound of a world continuing, perfectly calibrated, without the disturbance of my presence. I needed a sign of weakness, a fissure in their perfect facade, something more substantial than indifference. The first true break came not as a whispered secret but as a violation of the home's established acoustic rhythm. Tuesday morning, instead of the expected sound of the housekeeper vacuuming the library, there was a high, insistent whine followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a hammer drill. The sound originated from the west wing, directly above the secondary wine cellar, the area housing the secure, fireproof wall vault, where the corporate ledgers and the original trust documents were kept. They weren't cleaning. They were reinforcing. They were making physical changes to the structure to match the emotional changes they had already enacted. I pressed the cheap headphones harder against my ears, filtering out the bass drone of the drilling to capture the low-frequency vibrations. Minutes later, the drilling stopped, replaced by two distinct male voices. My father's, clipped and impatient, and Mr. Thorne, the family's estate lawyer, whose voice I hadn't heard in years. Thorne's presence meant this wasn't a minor administrative change. It was a formal legal maneuver executed under the cover of minor construction. "We need the signature block finalized before the end of the week, Robert," Thorne said, his voice dry and echoing slightly off the marble floor above. "The restructuring cannot afford any further delays, especially given the unforeseen complications." My throat tightened. Unforeseen complications. That was me, my father responded, his tone dangerously smooth. "It will be finalized. The board meeting is set for next Monday at 10. Ensure only the necessary proxies are present. We've managed to quarantine the situation sufficiently, but we need to demonstrate absolute unity to the shareholders." I listened, holding my breath until the stale cellar air burned in my lungs. Next Monday at 10, the annual Geller Trust Review meeting. A meeting that was, by mandate of my grandfather's will, mandatory for all three primary beneficiaries, a mandate designed specifically to prevent one sibling from being locked out by the others. My name was never explicitly mentioned in their short, functional exchange. There was no discussion of my attendance, no mention of my status, no contingency plan for my required vote. I was simply omitted from the logistics. It wasn't just exclusion, it was a systematic erasure. They weren't waiting for me to emerge. They were finalizing the family's financial future without acknowledging the chair I was supposed to occupy. They were treating me as legally and financially deceased, or worse, non-existent. The realization was colder than the concrete floor beneath my knees. I replayed the short snippet 5 times, focusing on Thorne's initial comment. "The restructuring cannot afford any further delays." Why restructure now, just weeks after my descent? They were clearly capitalizing on my physical absence to enact a long-planned coup. Then came the phrase that chilled me to the core, a casual addendum from Mr. Thorne as they moved toward the door. "And the preemptive amendment we discussed? The one pertaining to the incapacity clause? It's ready to be filed. We need to ensure that if she does attempt to resurface, the court won't even grant standing." The incapacity clause. They weren't just taking my inheritance, they were filing documents that declared me legally incompetent, mentally, emotionally, or morally unfit to handle my own affairs or vote on the trust. They planned to use my recent emotional breakdown and subsequent disappearance, which they manufactured, as ironclad proof that I was incapable of managing assets. They weren't seeking to neutralize me, they were seeking to lobotomize my legal identity. The isolation wasn't a punishment, it was the foundation of their legal defense. The last flicker of naive hope that perhaps they were only trying to protect themselves and not actively destroy me was extinguished by the lawyer's calculated language. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me gone without recourse, without the ability to sue, appeal, or even speak on my own behalf. I moved away from the duct, the sudden surge of adrenaline overriding the biting cold. The cellar was no longer a cage. It was the launching pad for a war that had just been formally declared, and I now had the target coordinates, Monday at 10, and the details of that preemptive amendment. Leverage wasn't enough anymore. I needed proof of their conspiracy, something irrefutable that would make the court and the press look at them as the criminals they were. The game had just escalated from defense to total offense. The transition from the icy, silent cellar to the polished, brightly lit foyer felt less like an entrance and more like a return to a theatrical stage where the lights were too harsh and every movement was scrutinized. The adrenaline, sharp and clean moments before, began to curdle into cold, calculated fury. I walked past the mahogany coat rack, its bulk now symbolizing the weight of the lie that defined this marriage. I knew the target, the time, and the mechanism. Now I needed the ammunition. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in performative normalcy. Richard sat across the vast dining table, discussing market liquidity and the upcoming board meeting with the detached enthusiasm he usually reserved for his vintage car collection. His eyes, though, did not meet mine. They skimmed past, focusing on the stemware or the centerpiece, creating an invisible yet impenetrable wall of silence. This was the quiet warfare I had anticipated, the complete emotional withdrawal, the calculated denial of the shared life that once was. I played the role of the slightly withdrawn, preoccupied wife, allowing his monologue to wash over me, while every nerve ending was dedicated to mapping the house's weak points. The preemptive amendment mentioned in the cellar was the key. It wasn't about divorce, it was about asset stripping under the guise of legal separation. I waited until the early hours of the morning, long after the heavy sound of his breathing confirmed deep sleep in the master suite, before I began the search. I bypassed the ornate safe. Richard was too. Arrogant to use it for active files, he kept operational secrets close, usually in the study, mixed in with mundane investment reports. The study was enormous, lined with books that were more status symbols than reading material. The air was heavy with the scent of old leather and his cigar smoke. I worked by the dim light of my phone screen, focusing on the deep drawers of his custom-built desk. The first breakthrough was small, almost insignificant, tucked inside a folder labeled Q3 Tax Projections. It wasn't a contract, but a scrap of tracing paper, a handwritten note in the spiky script of his counsel, Mr. Thorne. It read, "Transfer 70%, Ares Trust, before EOD 1011. The date was this coming Monday. Ares Trust. I hadn't heard of it, but the instruction was crystal clear. Move the bulk of the holdings offshore, out of the jurisdiction of the imminent proceedings, and do it. Before the 10 o'clock deadline I'd overheard. Discovery 1. Confirmation of the timeline and the fraudulent mechanism. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the vindication of a hunter spotting their prey. I photographed the note and replaced it precisely as I found it. The next morning I introduced the test. Casually over lukewarm coffee, I mentioned a fictional conversation with my estranged sister about her failed marriage. She said, her ex-husband tried to use some obscure offshore vehicle, an Ares or something, to hide assets. Can you imagine? I watched him closely. Richard didn't flinch. He didn't choke on his coffee. His response was delivered with the clinical indifference of a doctor diagnosing a mild rash. People get paranoid when they're desperate, darling. Tax shelters are legal. Hiding assets is illegal and sloppy. Rest assured, our finances are perfectly transparent and above board. Thorne would never allow anything questionable. His denial, so absolute and devoid of any genuine emotion, was more damning than a confession. It confirmed two things. He knew exactly what the Ares Trust was, and he was absolutely convinced of my ignorance. The silence thickened between us, no longer a void but a dense, suffocating medium laced with unspoken threats. He hadn't just shut down the query. He had redefined the parameters of our relationship. I was no longer a partner or even an enemy. I was an irritant to be managed and bypassed. The handwritten note was crucial, but it was circumstantial. I needed the digital paper trail, the wire instructions, the communications between Richard and Thorne detailing the transfer. This meant breaching his laptop, which was secured with military-grade encryption and an aggressive biometric lock. I knew the old password, a relic from the early days of our marriage, but he'd long since upgraded. I spent the afternoon monitoring his movements, waiting for that single, perfect moment of distraction. It arrived during his mandatory afternoon call with the Zurich office. He stepped away from his desk to pace the length of the veranda, the glass door separating us, his back to the equipment. I slipped into the study again, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced the sheer force of my intent would trigger an alarm. I wasn't after brute force, I was after human error. He had an external hard drive connected via USB-C, a temporary backup perhaps, or a quick transfer point. I risked everything, quickly disconnecting the drive and plugging in my own tiny encrypted flash drive, running a script designed to skim metadata and recent activity logs, hoping for a lapse in his security protocol. The download was agonizingly slow. Every tick of the antique grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow against my composure. Just as the transfer status reached 98%, I heard the distinct sound of the sliding glass door opening. Richard was returning. I snatched my flash drive, disconnected his external drive, and retreated behind the heavy velvet curtains just as he re-entered the room. He sat down, oblivious, and continued his call. My breath was shallow, constrained by the heavy fabric and the realization of how close I had come to catastrophic failure. Back in my temporary sanctuary, shaking with adrenaline, I accessed the drive. The metadata confirmed the Ares Trust was the destination, but the true horror lay in the associated emails. Discovery 2 was the explicit instructions, dated just 3 days prior, detailing not only the immediate transfer of 70% of liquid assets, but also a clause amending the original prenup to assign all outstanding corporate debt, a staggering figure that would cripple me, to my name, effectively bankrupting me the moment the divorce was finalized. The amendment was cleverly worded, disguised as an indemnification clause against previous operational losses. They weren't just taking the money, they were ensuring I'd be left drowning in his liabilities. This wasn't separation. It was scorched earth financial annihilation. The knowledge didn't just hurt, it crystallized the cold, predatory nature of the man I had married. The game had just moved past mere defense. It was time for absolute, undeniable confrontation, armed with proof of felony fraud. Monday was too late. The legal documents, now triple backed up and encrypted on a drive the size of a thumb, felt like a burning coal in my palm. Monday was too late because the clauses detailed a final transfer, a clean sweep scheduled for 7 a.m. on Tuesday. That gave me less than 60 hours to dismantle a facade built over a decade. I didn't return to the kitchen. I went straight for his home office, a fortress of expensive mahogany and false transparency. He was downstairs taking a business call, his voice booming with practiced sincerity, the sound of a predator charming his prey. I wasn't looking for confessions, was hunting for loose ends. The indemnification clause mentioned a complex web of LLCs linked to future lifestyle enhancements. I rifled through his desk drawers, ignoring the trivial piles of receipts and corporate swag. Deep in the locked bottom drawer, beneath a heavy stack of outdated financial periodicals, I found it. A slim, unmarked manila envelope, sealed with a piece of faded masking tape. Inside was the first truly personal blow. Wasn't another contract for the acquisition of distressed assets. It was a pre-approved 6-month lease agreement for a penthouse in Miami's south of Fifth neighborhood. The lease was under the name Atlantic Bridge Holdings Inc., a corporation I had never heard of, listing him only as the signatory agent. The rental amount was obscene, fully paid up front, and dated 4 weeks ago, right around the time he had started acting distant, blaming the stress of the merger. But the true gut punch wasn't the expense or the secrecy. It was the attached floor plan, meticulously marked up in red ink, showing furniture placement and notes detailing custom-built his and hers closets. Hers. The dimensions were entirely wrong for my wardrobe. The space wasn't being set up for us as later. It was being finalized for him and someone else now. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The initial shock of the financial betrayal had been cold and strategic. This was hot, personal acid. He hadn't just planned to financially ruin me. He had already replaced me, building a gilded cage for his new life while I remained here, unknowingly guarding his escape hatch. I photographed every page of the lease, the floor plan, and the corporate formation documents for Atlantic Bridge Holdings before replacing the envelope exactly as I had found it. The game had just escalated from corporate espionage to comprehensive existential destruction. When he finally came upstairs, humming a tune from a classic movie, he didn't even register the tension radiating from my posture as I stood by the bookshelf pretending to browse. He barely looked up from his phone, already absorbed in messages. "Long night," he mumbled, peeling off his expensive blazer and dropping it over a chair. A casual disregard for order that used to annoy me, but now felt like a taunt. "Everything all right with the merger?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly level, a thin sheet of ice over a freezing ocean. I needed to see the denial face to face, to witness the performance. He didn't miss a beat. "Just the usual end-of-quarter madness, darling. Lawyers are being lawyers. Nothing you need to worry about. Just need to sign off on a few more things Monday morning. Then we can breathe." He offered a practiced, fleeting smile, a mask of weary competence. This was the silencio phase, but it wasn't quiet. It was the deafening roar of intentional omission. He was lying through his teeth, meticulously performing the role of the stressed, honest provider, even as the paper trail of his deceit lay hidden less than 10 feet away. His dismissal wasn't just avoidance. It was a profound act of disrespect. Confirmation that he viewed me as a non-entity, incapable of understanding or acting. That night I didn't sleep in our bed. I moved to the guest room, ostensibly to read without disturbing him. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the encrypted files open on the laptop, tracing the connection between Atlantic Bridge Holdings and the operational losses mentioned in the fraud clause. The link was a registered agent address, the same one listed for a separate property management group we used for rental income. I logged into our shared digital safe, a space he foolishly assumed I didn't have permanent, unrestricted access to, and navigated to the property deeds section. I clicked on the file for this house, our home, the place where we had celebrated anniversaries and planned futures. The first document was the original deed, clean and clear. The second, dated just 2 weeks ago, was a shock that momentarily stole my breath and replaced it with sharp metallic panic. It was a preliminary title report, and attached to it was a purchase and sale agreement, PSA. The PSA was executed, signed by a shell corporation named Emerald Coast Acquisitions, and countersigned by his signature, notarized out of state. He hadn't just stolen our liquid assets, he was selling the physical foundation of our life out from under me. The closing. Date wasn't Monday, but Tuesday at 10 a.m., 3 hours after his final clean sweep transfer was scheduled. He was planning to hand over the keys to our marital home while I was sitting in a lawyer's office, realizing the accounts were empty. The proceeds of the sale, a staggering 8 figures, were not being wired to our joint account or even his personal account. The instructions clearly stated the funds were to be sent to a Swiss holding. The account number redacted, linked to Emerald Coast Acquisitions. The floor beneath me didn't just fall, it evaporated. I was living in a borrowed space, a ghost in my own life. Every photograph on the wall, every piece of furniture was already earmarked for transfer to a stranger. The Miami penthouse wasn't his escape. It was his next comfortable stop, funded entirely by the theft of everything we had built. This wasn't just felony fraud. This was calculated, premeditated homelessness. The realization brought a cold, terrifying calm. Sadness was a luxury I couldn't afford. I printed the PSA, the title report, and the wire instructions, making physical copies that could not be deleted or encrypted away. The paper crackled in the silence of the room. I looked at the time. 3:17 a.m., Saturday morning. The confrontation could no longer wait until the sun rose. If I waited, he might move the physical valuables or realize the extent of my knowledge. I needed to secure what little leverage I had left, starting with the immediate, overwhelming evidence of the depth of his criminality. If you've ever felt the absolute clarity that comes when everything is lost, you know the feeling. It's not desperation, it's lethal focus. The man who had committed financial murder was asleep in the next room, and I was about to become the avenging angel. It was time to choose my weapon. If this level of betrayal doesn't make you fight back, nothing will. The weapon I chose was silence, coupled with surgical precision. While he slept, heavy with the false security of his own malice, I moved to his travel bag, the one he insisted on locking even when it was empty. It didn't contain clothes. It held the small, heavily encrypted laptop he used for high-stakes transactions. The password wasn't difficult. It was the anniversary of the day he ruined his first business partner, a date he apparently considered a private holiday. Inside, amidst the shell company documents and transfer logs, I found a folder innocuously labeled Q4 Reports, Final Review. It contained no reports. It held recurring hefty wire transfers routed through 3 different Caribbean tax havens, culminating in a single high-frequency account managed under the name of a Panamanian trust. A subledger, however, broke down the trust disbursements, listing an entirely separate, smaller account, simply annotated with 2 words that froze the air in my lungs. Elena. Tuition. The financial crime had been the blueprint, but this was the foundation. I closed the screen instantly, the click resonating like a gunshot in the pre-dawn quiet. He shifted in the bed, groaning softly, and I immediately turned my back, moving to the window as if merely watching the rain. When he finally called out my name, the sound of it now a grotesque parody of affection, I didn't turn. "Just checking the schedule," I replied, my voice a flat, clinical monotone I hadn't known I possessed. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He sensed the shift. The easy warmth of our morning ritual had vanished, replaced by a vacuum, but he couldn't see the evidence, so he dismissed the feeling as morning grumpiness, rolling over to try and reclaim his sleep. That small, terrified silence from him confirmed my shift in strategy. I was no longer grieving. I was hunting. I didn't waste time confronting him about Elena. That would have yielded lies and a staged cleanup. Instead, I used the routing numbers and the precise disbursement schedule to map the life that the stolen capital was funding. Within the hour, cross-referencing public records and archived social media profiles that weren't immediately linked to him, I found her. She wasn't a casual affair. She was an architect living in Monaco, complete with 2 young children, one of whom was indeed enrolled in a highly exclusive private academy. The tuition payments matched the ledger perfectly. This wasn't a mistress receiving hush money. This was a fully operational parallel existence, a second family built entirely on the debris of our shared life and financial stability. The depth of the calculation was what truly stripped away the last vestiges of my humanity. He hadn't stolen the money to gamble or to fuel an addiction. He had systematically liquidated our assets, hollowed out our marriage, and leveraged my professional standing to finance his planned escape into a sun-drenched, unburdened future. Every trip, he claimed, was a stressful business negotiation. Every late night a fight to save the company was merely a logistical planning session for his permanent relocation. The financial ruin wasn't the goal. It was the necessary cover fire for his definitive abandonment. I realized I hadn't been married to a financially reckless man. I had been married to a ghost who had spent years preparing to vanish, leaving me holding the empty shell. I needed the final, undeniable anchor. The travel laptop yielded one last secret I almost missed. a synchronized, automatically backed up folder on a secure cloud drive he used for document storage. Within that deeply nested file, I found a thread of communications. Not emails, but an encrypted chat log with a name I didn't recognize, likely a lawyer or a fixer. The messages detailed the final exit strategy timeline, transfer of the remaining liquid funds from the corporate account, the last remaining safety net, scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow, confirmation of the closing on the Monaco property. The chilling final message was a simple instruction. Make sure all ties are severed before the final transfer. She needs to be completely locked out by midday. I was not just being betrayed, I was hours away from being rendered completely destitute, abandoned, and legally powerless. The focus shifted from justice to survival. If this level of cold, absolute premeditation doesn't compel you to move mountains, nothing will. The air in the library, usually thick with the scent of aged leather and contentment, now felt like a vacuum pressing against my eardrums. 12 hours. 12 hours until I ceased to exist financially, legally, emotionally. The email provided the what and the when, but the mechanics of the severing were locked away. I moved with a predatory stillness, my focus narrowed to the massive mahogany desk in his private study, the one he insisted on keeping secured by a fingerprint scanner and a reinforced steel door. Sentimentality had died with the timestamp of that last email. Now there was only tactical necessity. His security was meticulous, but his habits were sloppy. He had a superstitious aversion to relying entirely on biometrics, always keeping a physical key card tucked inside a hollowed-out first edition of The Art of War, a book he ironically fetishized but clearly never internalized. My fingers, trembling slightly, not from fear but from the coiled energy of pure malice, retrieved the card. The electronic lock hissed in protest as the green light flashed, granting me access to the sanctum where our shared future was being systematically dismantled. The temperature inside the study seemed 5 degrees, colder than the rest of the house. The target was obvious, the wall safe disguised behind a landscape painting, a heavy titanium vault designed to withstand everything short of a controlled detonation. He had always scoffed at digital security, preferring the brute force of steel. I knelt, my linen dress pooling around me, and stared at the keypad. The code, I knew instinctively, wasn't random. It was their anniversary, the date he married his first successful company, the real love of his life. I entered the 6 digits. The heavy tumblers groaned, a mechanical sigh of surrender, and the thick steel door swung inward, revealing a sparse collection of bound documents. Tucked neatly into a red leather folio marked Monaco Settlement, I found the ultimate proof of his calculated cruelty. It wasn't just a transfer deed, it was a complex 7-page legal document titled Declaration of Dissolution and Prenuptial Waiver Confirmation. He hadn't just prepared to divorce me, he had legally negated the existence of our common law partnership, leveraging a clause I was vaguely aware of, but had signed years ago under the guise of estate planning simplification. The language was surgical. I had unknowingly agreed to waive all future claims to communal property, provided the transfer occurred before a specific fiscal quarter, a quarter that ended tomorrow at midday. The horror wasn't the financial ruin, it was the absolute icy foresight. This wasn't a reaction to a fight. It was a strategic execution, planned perhaps a year in advance. My eyes raced over the final page, where his signature rested above the notary's stamp dated 3 weeks ago. Below it, in bold legal type, was the name of the offshore trust handling the acquisition and the lawyer facilitating the final lockout, Alastair Finch. I knew Alastair Finch. He was notoriously brutal, specializing in hostile asset seizures. To involve Finch meant this was a declaration of war, not a negotiation. My heart had stopped beating for sorrow and started hammering for mobilization. There was no time to cry, no space for shock. I needed this entire file. I carefully photographed every single page, the waiver, the trust details, the closing timeline, using a burner phone I'd bought months ago for a trivial, unrelated secret, a tiny act of independence that now felt like divine intervention. Then, I snatched the entire red folder, replacing it with a similar empty binder from the shelf to buy myself precious hours. He was too meticulous not to notice its absence eventually, but perhaps not before sunrise. I didn't pack a suitcase. I grabbed my passport, the folder heavy in a tote bag, and the car. Keys to my own separate vehicle, the one he rarely noticed. The silence of the house as I pulled out of the garage at 3:45 a.m. was profound, a vast, echoing emptiness that mirrored the void he had tried to create in my life. I drove not to a hotel, but to a discreet office park 40 miles away, where I knew a late-night private security firm operated. I needed anonymity and a Wi-Fi connection strong enough to reach the one person who could possibly stop Alistair Finch. I pulled up the name I'd heard whispered in hushed tones at corporate dinners, Madeline the Razor Thorne. She was known for her scorched earth tactics and an hourly rate that could fund a small country. I used the burner phone, bypassing secretaries and automated systems using a contact number. I'd bribed a disgruntled employee for 6 months ago. When she finally answered, her voice was sharp and devoid of warmth, even at 4:15 a.m. "You're calling on a burner about an emergency injunction," she stated, cutting through my nervous preamble. "That means you have proof and you have money. Which is it?" "I have the signed, predated waiver of rights, the trust details, and the closing confirmation for 9 a.m. tomorrow," I whispered, my voice thick with the gravity of the betrayal. "He's trying to legally erase me before midday." Madeline Thorne was silent for a terrifying moment. "This is not a settlement case. This is a litigation war against an extremely well-funded and organized premeditation. We need an emergency motion to freeze every relevant asset globally before the Monaco transfer completes. You need to wire $500,000 as a retainer immediately to my secure account. If the money isn't pending transfer confirmation by 6 a.m., you lose everything by 9 a.m. The price felt like another theft, the last gasp of air being sucked from my lungs, but it was the only bridge across the abyss. I accessed my last independent savings account, money I had inherited from my grandmother, and initiated the wire transfer. Watching those zeros disappear from my screen, knowing I was trading my last safety net for a gamble on vengeance, was the final irreversible act. I was no longer the victim reading a cruel email. I was the combatant funding the counteroffensive. If this history of absolute calculated betrayal doesn't make you seek swift and cold justice, nothing will. The 2 weeks following the wire transfer were the longest, most sterile period of my life. I had no doubt about the target or the method. The money had bought access, information, and most importantly, strategic distance. I didn't want a messy confrontation. I wanted clinical annihilation of their carefully constructed facade. The funds were allocated to 3 key areas: a digital forensics team to secure irrefutable proof of financial manipulation, a specialized legal consultant to draft the disclosure, and a single, well-placed media connection who understood the value of absolute silence until the precise moment of impact. I monitored the process from a rented apartment 2 states away, detached, viewing my own life as a chess game being played by hired professionals. The opportunity for maximum consequence presented itself at the annual board meeting, a mandatory formal dinner celebrating the family synergy that supposedly drove the enterprise. I wasn't expected to attend, which was precisely the point. My presence was represented not by my body, but by the undeniable truth. Precisely at 8:07 p.m., as the celebratory toast was being raised, the projector screen, meant to display the optimistic Q3 financial outlook, glitched, paused, and then displayed a single stark document header: Forensic Audit, Systemic Breach of Fiduciary Trust. I wasn't there to hear the gasps, but the live feed I received from the media consultant's discreet camera told me everything. The room's noise level didn't spike. It plummeted into a vacuum. I watched my betrayer, the architect of my isolation, pause mid-sip, glass frozen halfway to their lips, the color draining from their face in real time, replaced by a mottled clinical white. The initial slide contained only the aggregated data, dates, amounts, and the clear digital trail of illicit transfers. The subsequent slides, automatically scrolling every 30 seconds, offered the specific, granular details: the forged signatures, the shell corporations, the cold email exchanges outlining the strategy to systematically dilute my shares and discredit my character. My justice wasn't a confrontation. It was the silent, irrefutable presentation of facts to every single person whose respect they desperately needed. They didn't scream or deny. They just broke, publicly and permanently, under the weight of documented, calculated malice. I shut the laptop the moment the media contact confirmed the room was in full chaos and the necessary hard copies had been distributed. There was no catharsis, no triumphant fist pump, just a profound, heavy silence. I had won the war, but the battlefield was the scorched earth of my own family ties. The immediate aftermath was predictable: frantic calls, whispered threats, manipulative pleas for a private meeting to resolve the misunderstanding. I ignored them all. My peace was purchased with the destruction of every illusion I held about loyalty and obligation. I realized then the most fundamental and brutal lesson of my adult life: lineage guarantees nothing. Blood is merely proximity. It is never a guarantee of loyalty. The love and acceptance I had craved were always transactional, dependent on my subservience and convenience. When I finally refused to provide value on their terms, the contract was terminated with brutal efficiency. I had lost the last physical connection to my grandmother, the money, but I had honored her memory by refusing to allow her legacy to fund their continued deceit. The price of absolute, undeniable truth was utter isolation, yet isolation felt far safer and cleaner than the proximity of predators who wore familiar faces. That knowledge is the scar that will never fade, but it is a scar I earned. It demands respect. I am rebuilding my life from the outside in, free of the oppressive weight of expected forgiveness or false closeness. If you have ever had to, say, pay the ultimate price, your inheritance, your history, your belief in human goodness, to secure your own sanity and reclaim your truth, if you have ever found yourself standing alone in the aftermath of a betrayal so complete that it redefines reality, then you know the specific chilling ache of this kind of victory. And if the cold certainty of this calculated betrayal resonates with the whispers you hear in your own life, then maybe, just maybe, you understand why sometimes the only way to save yourself is to burn the bridge completely and never look back. The past is rubble. The future is finally, irrevocably mine.